In 1897, a train arrived at dawn in St. Ignace, Michigan, carrying 12 children. No one knew their names. No one knew their mothers. And most disturbingly, no one could find records of their birth. They were light-skinned, quiet, unervingly obedient. Their eyes followed priests instead of parents. And when asked where they came from, every child gave the same answer. From the water. For years, locals whispered that the lake was cursed. That Lake Huron sometimes returned what had been taken. But the truth, buried in parish archives and erased ledgers, was far more deliberate. These children were not lost. They were collected. Between 1880 and 1935, dozens of orphanages across the American Midwest, run by a little-known Belgian Catholic order, received children with no legal origin. No adoption papers. No immigration files. Only baptismal certificates signed overseas by men who had never stepped foot in America. And then, slowly, those children began to disappear again. Some were sent east, some south, some vanished into seminaries that officially did not exist. By the time federal inspectors arrived in 1939, the buildings were empty, the records were ash, and the priests had returned to Europe. What remained were the towns, and the silence they learned to keep. The group called themselves the Brothers of the Quiet Covenant. Officially, they were educators, linguists, missionaries. Unofficially, they answered to no American diocese and rarely to Rome. They arrived in the United States under charitable visas, funded by Belgian industrial families whose names never appeared on donation plaques. Their orphanages rose near railways, rivers, and border towns, places where children could move without questions. Church elders noticed something unsettling early on. The brothers refused local adoptions. They discouraged family reunification. And mothers, especially Black and Indigenous women, who attempted to reclaim their children were told the same thing. Your child has been chosen for a higher purpose. In reality, the order believed in a doctrine now erased from church history. That blood could be refined, that identity could be rewritten through separation, discipline, and silence. Children were renamed. Languages were forbidden. Memory itself became a sin. Surviving letters from one Michigan nun described children waking at night screaming in languages they had never been taught, crying for mothers who, according to official records, never existed. When questioned by American clergy, the brothers produced letters of authority bearing Belgian seals older than the nation itself. And when questioned by the state, they moved the children. In Louisiana, Mississippi, and Illinois, women began appearing at churches with the same story. They had given birth in church-run clinics. They had been told the child was sick or dead, and yet no grave, no body, no death certificate, only silence. These women were poor. Many were domestic workers. Some were former students of church schools. All were dismissed. Doctors said it was hysteria. Priests called it grief-induced delusion. Police refused to file reports without proof. But one woman, Esther Broussard, a laundress in Baton Rouge, kept a journal. In it, she described a Belgian doctor who insisted on being present during her labor, a priest who baptized her child before she could hold him, and a nurse who whispered only once, "They will take him north." Esther never saw her son again. Decades later, a boy matching her description appeared in an orphanage ledger in Wisconsin, under a different name, a different race classification, and a birthplace listed as unknown by design. That phrase appears again and again in surviving documents. Not unknown by accident, unknown on purpose. By the 1920s, federal officials were aware something was wrong. Immigration logs showed children entering the system without crossing borders. Census records contradicted church enrollment numbers. Entire orphanages reported 0 deaths, yet half their residents vanished before adulthood. An Internal Bureau of Investigation memo from 1927 warned, certain religious institutions appear to be operating a parallel system of child transfer beyond civil oversight. The memo went nowhere. Why? Because the brothers educated the children of senators. Because they spoke 6 languages. Because they framed themselves as protectors against communism, disorder, and racial unrest. And because the children they removed belonged to people no one in power intended to protect. When one investigator pushed too hard, his files were reassigned. When another demanded access to overseas records, his funding disappeared. By 1940, the order had quietly dissolved. No trials, no apologies, no acknowledgement, Only towns filled with adults who felt unfinished. The surviving children, now elderly, described the same recurring nightmare. A long hallway, bare feet on cold stone, a bell ringing once. They say they were taught not to ask who their parents were, not to ask why their skin darkened in summer but lightened in winter, not to ask why priests measured their skulls, their hair, their tongues, and above all, not to remember. One man, interviewed in 1974, broke down when shown a photo of a woman from Louisiana. They told us our mothers were dangerous, he said, that loving them would make us disappear. Many of these children became priests, teachers, translators. Some became nothing at all, but all carried the same wound. A life severed at birth, a history erased by design, and a truth buried so deeply that even now, it barely dares to surface. The seminaries did not appear on any official registry. They were not listed under diocesan oversight, nor did they report enrollment numbers to the state. On maps, they were labeled as abandoned schools, retreat houses, or sometimes simply nothing at all. Former students described being transported at night, windows covered, routes intentionally indirect. The same phrase spoken softly during the journey. You are being taken somewhere you cannot return from. These institutions were not meant to educate faith. They were meant to unmake identity. Children were separated by eye color, skin tone, bone structure. Names were replaced with numbers. Birthdays were reassigned to religious feast days. Any memory of family was treated as contamination, confessed, punished, erased. One ledger recovered from a burned seminary in Indiana contained only 3 columns. Original intake location, compliance score, disposition. There were no grades, no graduation dates, only assessments of how completely a child had detached from their origin. Those marked successful were sent onward to universities, foreign missions, intelligence-adjacent clerical roles. Those marked unstable were quietly removed. To where? No one knows. The buildings were demolished by the 1950s, replaced by farmland and housing developments. But locals still report something unsettling. The land refuses to feel empty. Hidden among Vatican correspondence seized during World War II was a reference to an unsanctioned belief system. It was called the doctrine of replacement. The belief was simple and terrifying, that nations decay when bloodlines remember suffering, that history itself creates resistance, and that the future could be stabilized by raising children severed from ancestral memory, loyal only to institutions that shaped them. The brothers believed children taken early enough could be reshaped completely, emotionally neutral, obedient, adaptable, not slaves, instruments. They were taught multiple languages without cultural context. They learned to blend, to pass, to disappear. Their mixed heritage, once a source of shame, was reframed as utility. They could belong anywhere, which meant they belonged nowhere. This was not genocide in the traditional sense. It was something colder. The removal of lineage. The sterilization of memory. A population engineered to serve power without ever knowing who had created them. And America, busy with wars, expansion, and profit, became the perfect testing ground. Every town near a quiet covenant facility shared the same behavior. They remembered, but never spoke. When journalists arrived, doors closed. When questions were asked, voices lowered. When names were mentioned, conversations ended. In one Wisconsin town, a diner owner admitted off record, "We were told those kids were dangerous to know." Dangerous how? Not violent. Not criminal. Inconvenient. They carried stories that contradicted official histories. They asked questions about documents that didn't exist. They made towns uncomfortable simply by surviving. Some residents insisted the children were never really there. Others admitted seeing them march in silence every morning. Identical coats, identical haircuts, identical expressions. What haunted people most wasn't what the brothers did. It was what the towns allowed. Church donations were accepted. Labor was used. Questions were buried. And when the order left, communities agreed, without ever meeting, to forget. In 1968, a graduate student at the University of Chicago uncovered something impossible. Birth certificates filed before the births occurred. Church documents predicting the arrival of children weeks in advance. Children whose mothers were never named, whose racial classifications changed between forms. The deeper he looked, the stranger it became. Social Security numbers assigned before applications. school transcripts with no prior enrollment, military service records for men with no childhood history, entire lives inserted into the system, fully formed. When the student attempted to publish his findings, his advisor warned him. Some histories are protected by very old hands. The paper was rejected. The files were sealed. The student left academia entirely. But copies escaped, and they began to surface, quietly, in archives, attics, private collections. Proof that these children were never meant to be found. In 1982, a dying Belgian priest requested a private audience with an American journalist. No tape recorder was allowed. No notes permitted. Only listening. The priest admitted the order had believed they were saving the world from itself. That suffering passed through generations like a disease. That love created loyalty stronger than law. And that to control the future, you had to start by stealing the past. Before dying, he said one final thing. We did not take children because we hated their mothers. We took them because mothers remember. And memory was the one thing the order could never control. Not all of the children disappeared. Some were placed deliberately, strategically, into positions where their origins would never be questioned. They became clerks in federal offices, translators during wartime, teachers in private schools, chaplains in hospitals and prisons. Their files show a pattern, assignments near power, but never inside it. Close enough to serve, never close enough to command. Many were selected for roles that required emotional distance. Immigration officers, census enumerators, intelligence aides, jobs where recording the lives of others mattered more than understanding one's own. They were praised for calmness, for obedience, for adaptability. Yet personal relationships rarely lasted. Marriages failed. Friendships felt hollow. Many reported a persistent sense of being observed, even decades after the order dissolved. Psychologists who later studied some of these individuals noted a shared trait, an absence of rooted identity, as if something essential had been surgically removed before it could form. The order did not want leaders. It wanted functioning ghosts. Children raised without lineage grow into adults who fear attachment. This was not an accident. The brothers believed love created allegiance stronger than doctrine. So they trained children to associate closeness with loss. Affection was followed by separation, trust by relocation, confession by punishment. By adulthood, many subjects described intimacy as dangerous. They loved carefully, briefly, and often, never fully. One woman, adopted by a prominent family in Ohio, described feeling like a guest in her own life. I learned how to behave, she said, but not how to belong. This emotional detachment became a quiet inheritance, passed not through blood, but through silence. Children raised by the taken children sensed something missing. Questions went unanswered. Stories ended abruptly. Trauma echoed forward, unseen. The order may have vanished, but its work endured, living on inside families that never understood why something always felt unfinished. A small number of survivors attempted the impossible. They searched for their mothers. Records led nowhere. Names had been altered, birthplaces erased, racial classifications revised to fit whatever narrative was required at the time. But memory, fragmented as it was, persisted. Some recalled songs. Others remembered smells. A few remembered a single word spoken in a language forbidden to them. In the 1970s, one man traced a baptismal mark to a rural Louisiana parish. The priest there confirmed a woman matching his description had given birth decades earlier and never stopped asking what happened to her son. She died believing he was alive. They never met. For others, the search ended in towns that refused to speak, churches that claimed floods destroyed records, and officials who quietly suggested letting the past remain buried. Because uncovering the truth would not just expose a crime. It would expose everyone who benefited from forgetting. There were no trials. No public reckoning. Why? Because responsibility was diffuse. The order blamed doctrine. The church blamed autonomy. The state blamed jurisdiction. Communities blamed ignorance. And the mothers? They were never considered witnesses. Many had died before anyone listened. Others were labeled unreliable. Some were institutionalized. Others learned to remain silent for survival. By the time human rights language entered public discourse, the evidence had been scattered across continents or deliberately destroyed. Justice requires names, and this system was designed to erase them. Today, historians argue over whether the order truly existed as described. They debate intent. They question scale. They soften language. But absence of proof is not proof of absence, especially when the absence was engineered. What remains undeniable is this. Thousands of people in America between 1880 and 1950 lived lives disconnected from origin, family, and truth. Not by chance, but by design. The greatest horror was never the taking of children. It was the creation of a world willing to pretend they were never taken at all. Long after the order vanished, patterns remained. Social workers in the 1980s noticed something unusual: adults with no childhood photos, no extended family, no medical history before adolescence. Their stories began late, as if life had started halfway through. Genealogists encountered dead ends that appeared too deliberate to be accidental. Entire bloodlines seemed to begin in silence. Some therapists reported patients haunted by a grief they could not name, mourning something they never consciously lost. These were not isolated cases. They were the aftershocks of an operation that did not need to continue in order to succeed. Once identity is severed, it fractures forward on its own. Trauma, when left unnamed, does not disappear. It reorganizes itself. Institutions survive by controlling language. An apology would require admission. Admission would require investigation. Investigation would require opening archives that have remained sealed for over a century. Instead, statements were issued about regrettable practices, about misunderstandings of the era, about charitable intentions. But intention does not erase consequence. What was done was not chaotic. It was systematic, documented, and repeated. An apology would confirm what many still fear: that faith was used not to protect the vulnerable, but to manage them. So silence continues, because silence is safer than truth. Perhaps the cruelest irony is this: some of the taken children grew up to enforce the very systems that erased them. They became administrators, clergy, archivists, gatekeepers of records, not out of malice, but because obedience was the only survival skill they were ever taught. They protected institutions not knowing those institutions had once consumed them. When asked why they resisted inquiries, one former church official said, "If I admit it happened, I have to admit I don't know who I am." For many, denial was not loyalty. It was self-preservation. There is no single word for what happened. It was not adoption, not slavery, not assimilation. It was something quieter: the deliberate interruption of inheritance, the theft of future memory, the transformation of children into proof that power can erase origin itself. History prefers clean categories. This story offers none, which is why it remains unresolved. Unlabeled horrors are the easiest to repeat.